The roar of the transport plane faded into the heavy stillness of the base as the female SEAL sniper stepped down from the ramp, her boots striking the ground with the steady rhythm of someone who had walked through chaos and come out alive. The air was thick with heat and the faint sting of burning fuel. She could still smell the dust of the desert on her uniform, still feel the weight of the rifle that had not left her side for days. Her eyes scanned the familiar rows of hangars and the faint silhouettes of soldiers moving in the distance. Every instinct told her something was off. The air felt wrong, like a battlefield just before an ambush. She had barely taken 3 steps onto the tarmac when movement caught her attention. Sharp. Precise, not the casual stride of off-duty soldiers, but the tight formation of military police approaching with deliberate speed. Their eyes cold, their weapons slung but ready. Her own hands hung loose at her sides, fingers brushing the fabric of her combat pants. She did not reach for a weapon, she did not speak. The lead, MP, stepped forward, his shadow long in the afternoon sun, and without a word, reached for her wrist. She did not resist, but she did not yield, either her eyes fixed on his, with the kind of look that could hold a man frozen in place. Cold steel closed around her wrists, the cuffs biting against skin still raw from the fight. The sound of the locking mechanism was louder than the noise of the airfield at that moment. She felt the eyes of the base on her soldiers paused. Mid-stride, mechanics looked up from under the wings of planes. Young recruits straightened in surprise. Whispers moved through the air like smoke. No one spoke her name out loud, but she could hear it in the fragments of sentences she caught sniper traitor orders disobeyed. She kept her chin high, her eyes scanning for threats, reading the body language of every soldier nearby. She had survived ambushes, minefields, and close-quarter firefights, and yet this walk across her own base felt like the most dangerous ground she had stepped on. The MPs turned her toward the main path leading across the base, the hot concrete glaring white under the sunlight. Every step made the chains rattle, a sound that cut into the air like distant gunfire. She knew that sound would carry far enough for everyone on the base to hear it and wonder the officers she passed kept their faces blank, their eyes flicking toward her for a fraction of a second, before looking away, as if afraid that even a glance might be taken as disloyalty. Some whispered low-trading versions of the story as if they had already decided what she was guilty of. Others watched silently, their expressions unreadable. Her boots hit the ground with the same rhythm as before, but the air seemed heavier now, each step pulling her deeper into whatever this was. She did not know the exact charges, not yet, but the way they had moved, the speed, the precision, the absence of warning, told her everything she needed to know. This was not routine. This was not paperwork or misunderstanding. This was planned. She could feel it in the way the MPs avoided looking at her directly, as if even they knew they were playing a role in something. Larger than themselves, somewhere behind the lines of uniforms and clipped voices, she felt the presence of someone watching someone who had not yet revealed themselves, someone who knew more than they were letting on. And as the gates of the tribunal building came into view, she knew this was only the first step into a different kind of battlefield. The sun was still high and merciless above the base. As the female SEAL sniper was led down the main path, the sound of her boots steady against the concrete, but the chains around her wrists told a different story. Each link clinking in rhythm like a slow, deliberate clock counting down to something none of them could yet see. Her uniform was torn in places, dirt still clinging to the fabric, her hair pulled back tight. Yet strands had escaped framing her face with the grit of long days without. Rest her eyes stayed forward, locked on some invisible point beyond the horizon, ignoring the murmurs that swelled and died in her wake. Rows of soldiers stood at attention along the path, their posture sharp, but their eyes restless, flicking toward her and away. Some held their breath as she passed. Others leaned ever so slightly toward the man next to them to exchange words too low for anyone else to hear. Stories began to spark in the shadows of their conversations, each one different, some claimed she had refused to follow orders in the middle of an operation. Others whispered about a mission gone wrong deep in enemy territory. A mission so classified even high-ranking officers could only guess its details. A few swore they had seen her in action, seen her take shots from impossible distances, save lives with impossible timing, and yet here she was, chained like a prisoner. Every step seemed to stretch the space around her. Slowing time, she could see the faces of the younger soldiers. In the crowd, their eyes wide, not with judgment, but with confusion, and maybe something like awe. They had heard of her before they had joined. They had listened to the stories of the sniper who could make a kill from a mile away in the middle of a storm, the one who could vanish into the night and reappear behind enemy lines without leaving a trace. And now they were watching her being walked into judgment as if the base itself could not decide whether to fear her or revere her. She could feel the weight of the sun pressing down on her shoulders, mixing with the heavy pull of the chains. The MPs on either side of her kept their pace measured, neither too fast nor too slow, their hands resting near their weapons, though they knew she could not reach them still. The tension was there, a quiet knowledge that even restrained she was dangerous. Her mind traced every corner of the base, every vantage point, every open space and narrow corridor she could escape if she wanted. She could disappear into the maze of buildings and supply routes, but she did not, because running would confirm whatever lies had been planted about her. The march took them past the motor pool, past rows of armored vehicles lined in perfect order, their metal, shells glinting in the light. She caught the faint reflection of herself in one of the windshields. A soldier out of place, a weapon out of reach, an operator stripped of her element. Yet still standing, the path narrowed ahead, funneling them toward the tribunal building, its tall stone walls cutting into the sky like a fortress, built not to protect but to judge. The air grew cooler in its shadow, the sound of the chains sharper against the echo of their steps, somewhere high above on the balcony. A figure stood watching, motionless, though too far for her to read his face. Something in his stance told her he was no idle observer. His presence carried weight, and in the space between one step and the next, she felt the shift in the air as if the base itself was holding its breath. Something was waiting for her inside those walls. Something that had been set in motion long before her boots touched the tarmac, and as the MPs pushed the doors open, the cool darkness of the tribunal swallowed her whole. The tribunal chamber was a world apart from the heat outside. Its air carried the weight of authority and the chill of stone walls that had heard too many secrets. The light was dim, falling in sharp lines across the polished floor where her boots echoed in slow, deliberate steps. The MPs guided her forward, their grip firm. But she did not stumble. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in the rows of uniforms, the rows of medals, the rows of silent faces, each one fixed on her as if trying to decide whether they were looking at a hero or a criminal. At the center stood a colonel, his stance rigid, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. He began to read the charges, each word, slow, heavy, deliberate, disobeying direct orders, compromising the mission, endangering Allied lives, conduct unbecoming an officer. The words were meant to sting, to carry the weight of shame, but they passed over her like smoke. She did not flinch, she did not shift. She kept her eyes locked on him, and in that gaze there was something unshakable. Something that made even the colonel pause between sentences. Around the edges of the chamber, officers whispered behind cupped hands, their eyes darting from her to the colonel and back again. Some of them had served long enough to know her record, the sniper who had once held a ridge alone against an advancing force for 17 hours, the one who had made the impossible shot in the middle of a sandstorm, when visibility was nothing but blur and instinct. Yet here she stood accused by her own. The contrast was too sharp, too strange, and it rippled through the room like an invisible current. The colonel moved to the part of the charges that hinted at betrayal, an operation deep in hostile territory, where orders had been given and she had chosen a different path. His voice rose with the accusation painting her decision as recklessness and arrogance. He spoke of lives risked of consequences beyond the battlefield. His words were weapons meant to pierce the respect she had built through years of service. But each time he paused, expecting reaction, there was nothing, only her calm breathing and the quiet steadiness of her posture. She glanced once at the men and women seated at the high table behind the colonel, their faces carved from stone, yet their eyes not quite as still. One woman shifted in her chair as if something in the colonel's account did not match the story. She knew another man kept his hands folded, but his gaze rested on her like he was weighing truth against duty. The tension grew thicker with each passing moment, until even the MPs at her sides shifted their stance, subtly aware that this was not going the way they had imagined. Her mind moved faster than the words being thrown at her, each sentence filed away compared against the real events. Each omission noted, each distortion marked. She could feel the shape of a larger game here, something political, something meant to make her an example. And she knew. Examples were rarely chosen at random. Someone had decided she would be the one to stand here in chains and take the weight of something far bigger than herself. When the colonel finally stopped, the silence was heavy, broken only by the faint scratch of a pen on paper somewhere in the back of the room. She let the quiet stretch just long enough for the unease to grow, just long enough for every eye to stay fixed on her, and in that moment before the next voice spoke, before the next step unfolded, she knew the real battle was about to begin. The silence inside the tribunal was thick enough to press against the skin. The colonel stood at the center of it. His shoulders squared, his lips tightening as if ready to speak again when the heavy wooden doors at the back of the chamber slammed open with a force that made every head turn. The sound cracked through the air like the first shot of a battle boots, echoed slow and deliberate, each step claiming the space until the figure came into view, a four-star general, his presence filling the room before his voice ever touched it. He did not rush. He did not need to. Every step was measured, every movement a statement. His chest was a wall of medals, each one a story written in blood and sacrifice. His uniform, crisp yet worn at the edges. From years in the field, his eyes scanned the room, and when they found her, they locked without wavering. Something old passed between them, something forged far from this room, under skies that had seen gunfire and firestorms. His gaze carried the weight of memory and the promise of action. The MPs at her sides stiffened their grip, shifting without meaning. To their training told them to stand their ground, but instinct told them they were in the presence of someone who could override their very orders. The general kept walking, closing the distance until he stood in the center of the chamber. The colonel's voice faltered for the first time since the proceeding began. His jaw moved, but no words came. Instead, he stepped back, just enough, to acknowledge the authority that had just entered. No one in the room breathed too loudly. The officers at the side tables straightened their posture, their eyes flicking between the general and the accused. They knew the history, at least parts of its stories whispered in mess halls of the sniper who had covered the general during a night assault in hostile territory when the extraction point had been compromised, and the enemy had the high ground of how she had taken a shot. No one else could make saving not only his life, but the lives of every man and woman in that operation. The general turned his attention from her to the colonel, his voice calm, but with an edge that cut deeper than anger. "Colonel, I will take it from here." The words were simple, but they carried a finality that could not be challenged. He stepped toward her, his eyes scanning the chains at her wrists, then returning to her face. For a moment, neither spoke, yet the exchange was louder than anything that had been said that day, a silent recognition of what was at stake and a shared understanding of battles fought both on and off the field. He turned back to the tribunal, his posture unyielding, and began to speak, his words measured but carrying a weight that shifted the air in the room with each sentence. He reminded them that the measure of a soldier was not in blind obedience, but in the ability to act decisively. When lives were on the line, he spoke of missions where the written orders would have meant certain death, and how those who dared to adapt had turned defeat into survival. With every example, the accusations began to crack, not yet broken, but no longer unshakable. From her place in the center, she watched the faces around the room. Change some, held on to their judgment, their suspicion. Others were beginning to see the edges of a different story. One where she was not the reckless operative painted by the colonel, but a soldier who had acted with precision in the chaos of war. The general's voice did not rise, yet it carried the force of someone who had commanded men and women into fire and brought them home. And as his final words settled into the silence, the tribunal knew the tone of this battle had shifted. The four-star general did not raise his voice, yet every syllable struck like a hammer against the fragile shell of the accusations the tribunal had built. He stood in the center of the chamber, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his presence unshaken, as if the very air in the room bent to the gravity he carried. He began not with opinion, but with fact recounting missions. The public would never know of operations buried under layers of classification and silence. He spoke of a night in the northern mountains, when a unit was pinned under enemy fire, with no hope of air support. The chain of command had given orders to retreat, orders that would have left the wounded behind. She had ignored those orders and stayed in position, covering the evacuation route from a ridgeline nearly a mile away, holding off advancing enemy forces until the last of the injured were pulled to safety. He described the precision of her shots, the endurance that kept her steady through the freezing night, and the knowledge that without her, every one of them would have died. The colonel tried to interrupt, but the general's gaze cut him down without a word, continuing with the same deliberate pace. He revealed pieces of classified orders from the mission now under scrutiny, orders that contradicted the version the tribunal had been given. The details painted a different picture, one where she had not disobeyed, but had followed the true intent of the mission, adapting to changing threats, in a way only the most seasoned operator could. He explained how the alternative would have meant an ambush that would have erased an entire team from existence. The room was no longer still. It was shifting under the weight of truth. Some officers leaned forward, their eyes locked on the general as if absorbing every word. Others shifted uncomfortably, their earlier certainty eroding piece by piece. The MPs at her sides did not move, but she could sense the subtle change in their stance, a loosening of the tension that had held them rigid since they placed the chains on her wrists. The general moved from one example to another, each one a strike dismantling the structure of the case. He described the sniper's work in dense urban terrain where every shot had to be threaded between civilians and allies, her ability to move unseen through streets crawling with hostile patrols. He reminded them that war was not a checklist of procedures, but a storm where survival demanded both skill and judgment, and that she had both in measures few could match. The colonel's face had grown tight, his knuckles white against the table, but he did not speak. He knew that every attempt to counter would be drowned in the credibility and authority of the man standing before him. The general had not come to ask for her release. He had come to make it impossible for them to hold her any longer without exposing their own failure. When the general finished, he stepped back, his words still hanging in the air like the echo of distant gunfire. The tribunal members glanced at one another, some avoiding each other's eyes entirely. No one spoke for several long seconds, the weight of the moment settling into every corner of the chamber. The accusations had been reduced to fragments, and in their place stood a narrative that could not be ignored. She remained silent throughout, but inside she knew the tide had turned, and the fight was no longer about her survival. It was about their integrity. The silence that followed the general's final words was heavier than any chain the tribunal had placed on her. The air felt still, and yet charged, as if the entire room stood on the edge of something irreversible. The colonel's gaze had dropped. To the table in front of him, his shoulders rigid but unmoving. The members of the tribunal exchanged glances, some brief, some lingering, their expressions shifting in the space between calculation and reluctant acknowledgement. One of the MPs at her side finally moved his hand, reaching for the key. The sound of metal against metal filled the chamber as the lock turned. The chains fell with a dull clink against the polished floor. The sound rang out longer than it should have, as if the entire building needed to hear it. She did not flex her wrists or rub at the red marks left by the steel. She simply let the weight fall away and stood taller. The absence of the restraints changing nothing about the way she carried herself, the general's. Eyes met hers across the narrow space between them. No salute, no words. Only the briefest nod. A silent exchange layered with years of unspoken trust and battles fought where no one else could bear witness. It was enough she understood the message, as clearly as if he had shouted it. This is over for now. But the war is never finished. She turned toward the door, her boots striking the floor with the same steady rhythm they had when she arrived, but now the sound was different. No longer the walk of a prisoner under guard, but of a soldier in control of her own steps. The officers she passed rose slightly from their seats, some with respect, others because they did not know what else to do. Their eyes followed her every movement as if committing the sight to memory. Outside, the sunlight struck her face, blinding for a moment. After the dim light of the chamber, the warmth cut through the chill she had carried since stepping off the transport. Her shadow stretched long across the courtyard, as she walked the MPs following a few paces behind, not as captors now, but as escorts. She could hear the whispers beginning again around the bass voices carrying half-truths and guesses, but this time, the tone had shifted. There was less venom and more awe, the kind reserved for stories that would grow with every retelling. She passed the motor pool again, the armored vehicles lined in perfect rows, and caught her reflection once more in a windshield. This time, the face looking back at her was not the same as the one that had stepped off the plane hours before she had been stripped of weapons and dignity in front of her own, and yet she had walked out without bending her spine, without letting them see the crack they had tried to make. The General emerged from the building behind her, but did not call out. He simply watched as she continued toward the far side of the base, toward the barracks that had been hers before all this began. There would be debriefings and reports and maybe more attempts to pull her into the politics she had no taste for. But none of that mattered. Now she had survived the kind of battle that left no smoke and no spent shells. Only the quiet understanding that reputation and honor were sometimes worth more than the medals they weighed on a uniform. She did not look back as she disappeared into the heat haze, her figure fading into the distance while the bass kept whispering her name, the legend already beginning to take root in the minds of those who had seen her walk in chains and leave without them.